We are at an inflection point from a history, 200 years, of the global industry and economy being largely driven by fossil fuels, to a future where the world's technologies and industry and commerce will significantly be built out of specialty metals. And it's a 20-year transition, and it has lots of challenges, and it'll have ups and downs, but it is irreversible and unstoppable. So in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years' time, the transition to electric mobility from diesel and petrol engine vehicles, the transition to grids that are dominated by renewable energy sources and energy storage, are trends that are increasingly baked into the global environment, for good reason, and we can't afford for them to be delayed or disrupted or reversed. That means that we have to completely transform the supply chains feeding this transition, and we need to produce cleanly and responsibly many, many times the present global production of all of the key ingredients of batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar cells, and other elements of this really epic transformation of the global landscape. And that will create significant shortages over the coming 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years in this, what is essentially a 20-year supply dislocation for critical minerals, feeding the energy transition and feeding climate change mitigation and feeding all of these new technologies. And that's not going to be smooth or easy. You know, the scalability and transformability of our industry to meet these needs is not efficient. And therefore, even while we might be in a short-term period of relatively subdued market sentiment and a degree of oversupply of lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth metals, this short-term market weakness is firstly totally divorced in terms of its drivers from medium-term realities of structural short supply, and secondly is resulting in this structural short supply of all of these critical minerals 3 years out, 4 years out, 5 years out, growing every day. And that's before you look at the global geopolitical landscape and national security implications of these global critical mineral supply chains. It is a challenge, and the market has been and continues to fail the world with respect to adequately supporting this enormous transformation of our industry, both in terms of volumes, in terms of standards, because we want to feed the energy transition with supply chains that are rigorous from an ESG compliance and carbon footprint point of view, and the industry and the supply chains need to transform to balance reliance on Chinese interests, who have over the last 15, 20 years, while everybody was sleeping, come to dominate the global supply of all of these key metals. So in order to finance this transition, which requires many hundreds of billions of dollars over the coming years and decades, we do need to mitigate market failure, and we do need regulatory and government funding agency and sovereign wealth funding agency support on the one hand, even though as private sector players we are not just, we can't afford to sit back and wait for governments to solve the problems. We need to solve the problems. However, we do need help to solve the problems, both in terms of de-risking and financing the transformation, and in terms of helping to educate and incentivize and regulate our critical minerals industry in such a way as to catalyze access to private sector institutional funding sources who up till now have largely ignored our industry, to the detriment of the world and ultimately to the detriment of those financial institutions because we are at the beginning, because of this 20-year supply-demand dislocation, we're at the beginning really of an epic value creation opportunity, quite apart from the growing challenges to do what we need to do to create the right supply. And the reason why we've had much less institutional and listed equity market support for what we have to do as a mining and metal industry is partially as a result of the historical unfashionability of our space and the perceptions that mining and metals are fundamentally a relatively high ESG and PR risk that in the eyes of big institutions is therefore best left to others, i.e. to the Chinese. And that's a perception we have to do better and we need help in redressing. And it's not true. Doesn't come from nowhere in terms of an element of the history of our industry, but mining can and has to be well-governed, transparent, and constructive in terms of low environmental impact, in terms of constructive and positive community, social, political engagement, and in terms of carbon footprint, all of which have challenges, all of which cost money and take time, but all of which are possible and necessary. And in the case of TechMet, we uphold very high standards across all of our now 10 operating assets, and as do many others in our industry, put a lot of emphasis on standards. The mega trends with respect to exponential growth in demand for lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth metals, tin, and the other metals that we as TechMet focus on are the transition to electric mobility and batteries and electric motors and the specialty metals and metal chemicals that go into the manufacturing of those components. And obviously, similarly, what goes to build wind turbines and solar cells and batteries to support renewable energy systems. I think a dimension of the exponential growth in demand over the coming years that will drive this necessary transformation of metals and mining is also the growing dominance of data processing and data center capacity required to drive AI applications. And I think the significance of that in terms of required energy and required grid infrastructure and renewable energy generating capacity that is required in order to do that responsibly with low carbon footprint is going to be a massive driver of demand for many of these metals. It's a challenge, and it's a challenge we have to face as an industry much better than we have been facing it over the last decade, when investment in these critical minerals has increased, but apart from what China has continued to do to accelerate their investment programs, it has increased at a much, much lower rate than is necessary to meet this massive medium-term structural short supply of all of these critical minerals. The question is what we do about narrowing that gap and bringing in the funding in order to do that. We need to encourage the big global mining companies to overcome their natural bureaucratic conservatism and lack of imagination to engage in our metals and our space much more proactively than they have been doing. And they have the capital, they have the project execution capacity, and they can make a much bigger contribution to our industry's transformation than is presently the case. But there, with some exceptions, Rio's moves into lithium, obviously others' involvement in nickel and cobalt is material, but not as to the extent it should be. We do need to, as I mentioned earlier, help to educate, regulate, and incentivize big institutions to engage in our space, private sector institutions, and that's a government job, but also an industry job from an educational and engagement point of view. And we need to help governments, most notably the US government, who are the most important in our space, but certainly European governments and the EU institutions and those relevant institutions in Korea and Japan and elsewhere, to more efficiently and on a bigger scale engage in de-risking and funding the supply chains for critical minerals, feeding their domestic industries in this transition. And the costs of not doing that are enormous. Let's take climate change mitigation aside and take national security and geopolitical balance with China aside, which are difficult to take aside because they're very, very big and pressing and important themes. But we're fundamentally talking about industrial competitiveness and jobs and growth. So we're not only talking about national security and climate, we're talking about social cohesion. We're talking about overcoming increased polarization and dysfunction associated with populist politics and the risk to stability and security, and Western being not necessarily the right term, but the values of freedom and democracy that we want to continue to dominate the world that our children and grandchildren grow up in. I think there are a lot of government funding agencies around Europe and the States and elsewhere who are increasingly prioritizing deployment of capital and support in critical mineral supply chains. And that's great. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US, what we have done with the DFC as a US government funding agency who's now made 3 rounds of equity investment in TechMet, what the Department of Energy is doing, what Department of Defense are doing, etc. And that's beginning to be mirrored by a range of institutions, both national and European, in Brussels and other capitals of Europe, as is the case in Seoul and in Tokyo. So all of that is very, very important. Other elements of the government-related funding landscape that are becoming very important and will become even more important are sovereign wealth funds, which is somewhat different to the government funding agencies that we engage with as TechMet and others are working with in the US and Europe. And the Gulf is a very, very important part of that landscape. I mean, we have, as TechMet, received substantial investment from the QIA as the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Qatar, which is enormously invaluable to us. And they're an extremely dynamic organization who do understand fully what we're trying to achieve in terms of value creation opportunities over the coming years in critical minerals, in terms of the global imperatives to transform our industry and support and finance the transformation. And likewise, what is being done in Riyadh by a range of sovereign entities in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere is very significant and will grow in significance given the liquidity in the Gulf and given the imperative on the part of Gulf governments to diversify away from economies dependent on fossil fuels and participate, create value, and make a meaningful impact in this transition from a supply chain point of view. So those are, and that will be to an extent mirrored elsewhere in the world in terms of focus of attention, flow of funds on the part of other sovereign funding agencies. I don't think it's a constraint to build projects responsibly in terms of ESG standards and in terms of carbon footprint certainly tends to take a bit longer and cost a bit more. But by doing so, one not only is doing the right thing in terms of responsibly transforming our industry, but you're also opening up access to other sources of funding to cut our cost of capital and build bigger, quicker. And you're also ensuring that your products have preferential access to market because the big automakers and others increasingly will be judged on the transparency and standards of their supply chain, and therefore they'd far rather buy clean, green nickel as we are building in Brazilian nickel under TechMet and others than less well-governed, less transparent and less secure sources of nickel from Indonesia or elsewhere. So we may not get a price premium, but we certainly get preferential access to market. So ESG in my mind is a value driver and a value adder, not a detriment to scale and pace of development, albeit it has its challenges.